it's commonly thought that Americans care little for what goes on outside their borders. One thing is for sure, though, they do care how their politicians look abroad. Well, that's what's been driving Mitt Romney's tour of America's closest allies this week. The presumptive Republican Party nominee, yes, we still have to call him that, has been to Britain and Israel and today ended the tour in Poland.
In the 1980s,
well, with the US election now less than 100 days away, Romney's trying to prove himself the international statesman. But he's come under fire from individuals as diverse as the Mayor of London and a top Palestinian aide. Well, Beijing today also joined the chorus of condemnation. So few friends abroad, but what do Americans make of it all? Is Romney a gaffe-prone wannabe or a clever politician with his eye firmly fixed on the White House? Well, let me introduce you to tonight's guest. Newsweek's Paris Bureau Chief and Middle East Editor Christopher Dickey is here with us in the studio. Also with me is Erik Svane. He's a member of Republicans Abroad France. Good evening to you. We did call Democrats abroad as well, I should point out. They did not want to take part in tonight's debate. Over in the United States, in Maine, is Aaron David Miller. He's a scholar at the Wilson Center, and he's been an advisor to both Republican and Democratic Secretaries of State for over 20 years. Also joining us tonight in Israel is Mordechai Kedar. He's a researcher at the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies at Bar Ilan University. Good evening to you all. Now, the most controversial part of Romney's talk was in Israel. He was slammed for making the following comments in Jerusalem.
It's always an inspiring and moving experience to be in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel, to share one more time our friendship, but also to see the progress of this extraordinarily vibrant and growing nation and people.
All right, that drew international condemnation, particularly in the Western media. But take a listen to this. Here's Obama on the campaign trail in 2008.
Jerusalem will remain the capital of Israel, and it must remain undivided.
All right, well, let's start in Israel, seeing as that's the country we're talking about. Mordechai Kedar is there for us. Mordechai, why is it OK for Obama but not for Romney? And what do Israelis make of all this controversy?
Well, I really don't understand why there is any controversy about Jerusalem. Jerusalem was announced the capital of the Jews in the year of 1004 BCE, while Paris, for example, was announced as the capital of France in 1108 CE, means more than 2,000 years after Jerusalem. And Washington is a very young capital, which was announced in 1720 CE. So why in the world do we Jews have to ask the permission of anyone in the world to have our capital, our ancient capital in Jerusalem?
Well, the Palestinians would argue that it is undecided, and back in 1948 it was supposed to be an independent city, and that they are still claiming that the east of the city is the capital of any future state.
Can you name one Palestinian king or emir or sultan who reigned for even one day in Jerusalem? Nobody. When was there a Palestinian state in this country? Where was the currency of this Palestinian alleged state? This is an invented term, the Palestinian nation, and let them have a capital wherever they like. Why sticking to the Jewish capital, which is the capital for more than 3,000 years of the Jews only?
All right. Christopher Dickey, leaving the history aside for the moment, is it appropriate for an American leader...
Aside. Don't we want to go back and talk about what happened 2,000-3,000 years ago? No, I don't think we do. In fact, the issue with Romney was not that he said that Jerusalem would remain the capital of Israel. The issue was whether the United States would move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. In another interview, not the clip you showed, he said that it would, although he said in a typical Romney sort of thing, he waffled a bit and said he would do it in consultation with the Israeli government. Well, of course, but that's the real issue. What's going to be the diplomatic stand of the United States vis-a-vis the placement of the embassy, which is real inside baseball diplomatically, but almost all these debates in and around Israel usually are.
Erik Svane, clearly those comments about Jerusalem are very controversial, but what does seem bizarre is talking about the hand of God. He was saying that providence had something to do with the Israelis being more affluent than the Palestinians. He said it was that their culture, he suggested their culture was superior. I mean, comments like that are quite offensive.
Well, I would say that half the time when people say that they're offended, they're really trying to get people to follow a certain policy. They're really not. There's a reason you want to be. One of the reasons you want to show you're offended is you want people not to go a certain way, and you have to admit that in the Middle East, the Israelis have created more, have made more inventions than their Arab neighbors have. And that is, I hate to say that. I hate to say that it's maybe politically incorrect, but it's the truth. I mean, they have more inventions, they have more Nobel prizes than any of their Arab neighbors do.
Mordechai Kedar, do you think Mitt Romney would be a better friend to Israel than Barack Obama has been? I mean, given that Israel's Deputy Prime Minister Ehud Barak said that the Obama administration has done more than anything I can remember in the past in terms of assuring Israel's security.
Well, just to complete the former point, as much as I heard, Mitt Romney is a devout Christian, and he knows exactly who was Jesus Christ, for example, who was born a Jewish, who grew up in Jerusalem, preached in Jerusalem more than 2,000 years ago, and he was crucified as Jewish. So being a Christian,
I definitely carry on.
Understands better the Israeli point of view about this issue.
He identifies himself as a Mormon specifically.
Yes. Now, regarding the Israeli security, I am not sure that he really understands the Middle East. Unfortunately, both George W. Bush and Barack Hussein Obama both made big mistakes about the Middle East. George W. Bush had a golden opportunity to bring remedy to the problems of Afghanistan as of 2001 and to the illnesses of Iraq as of 2003. But he didn't take this opportunity for unknown reason, because he didn't understand the Middle East. This region, in this region, there are too many dead body politics, just like Afghanistan and Iraq. He should have divided them to tribes or to ethnic groups or to religious groups or to sectarian groups. And this is the only thing which can survive in this arid region. Just like the Gulf Emirates, which are stable only because of the fact that every and each of them is one single tribe. And this is the way how to live in the Middle East.
All right, we're having a few technical problems.
When you are separate from the others, you let others live their lives.
Christopher Dickey, if I could bring it back to the US election. In the US...
Let me just say, Laura, I think it's really good for your listeners to hear those opinions, that the mistake of the United States, particularly of the Republicans and also of Obama, was not to divide the Middle East into lots of tribes, because only tribes can survive in the desert. I think it's really good to hear that from somebody speaking, from Israel. Don't you think that's a valuable opinion?
I think perhaps what he's saying is when you look at some of the conflicts, particularly in Syria today, a lot of those conflicts are now falling along tribal lines, and in Libya
he's
as well.
Saying
but
that
it's
after the United States invaded Afghanistan and after the United States invaded Iraq, it should have encouraged tribalism as much as possible, because that's the only way that those people can survive.
Let's, I think
May I point something out? I'd just like to point out that in the past year and a half, we've seen the Arab Spring and all these revolutions in the countries. And for the past decades, 2, 3, 4 decades, we've heard how terrible Israel is and how much the Palestinians have suffered and all this. And when you think about it, and I'm sure a lot of Muslims, or not just Muslims, but will also be offended by this. But I think a Muslim living in Israel has a better life than a Muslim living in Gaddafi's Libya or in Assad's Syria. And while we always hear these terrible stories about how terribly they're treated. Nobody's treated as badly as the Libyan people and Libyan Muslims, as Syrian Muslims,
so what's your point?
Saddam Hussein's people.
What is your point?
The point is the reason we've been focusing on Israel these past years and on the Palestine problems, so-called, is because
you don't think there's a Palestine
it served
problem?
them well. It served them well.
You don't think there's a Palestine problem?
I think that the problem of the Muslims in Libya was far worse.
Well, nobody
talks to nobody.
Please.
Libya was on the United Nations. Libya was on the United Nations Human Rights Council. Israel was never on there. Why was Muammar Gaddafi up there? Why was Saudi Arabia on the United Nations Human Rights Council?
I think if I may, what he's saying is the Palestinian problem is often at the top of foreign policy agendas at the UN. Syria and Libya were both on the Human Rights Council.
People who are being treated far worse. They're being murdered.
He said it's disproportionate.
The argument always goes that Gaddafi's prisons, they dropped hand grenades.
One at a time, Christopher.
Look, the Palestinian problem has been exploited endlessly by lots of Arab leaders in the most cynical possible way. There's no question about that. But it's been exploited precisely because the resentment of occupation is such a strong sentiment in the Arab world, and in fact in most of the former colonially occupied countries of the world. That's actually the focus of attention on Israel again and again. Israel, in the minds of lots of people in developing countries around the world, was a colonial outpost imposed on the Arab world. Now, that can be argued endlessly. For God's sake, let's not argue that endlessly today. But that was the perception, and that's why it has been a symbolic issue again and again.
But they've nourished it. The Arab leaders have nourished it. They've nourished it.
Yes,
and
absolutely. They did. They did
to
cover.
problems.
They did absolutely.
And
I don't disagree with you.
We say we're always speaking about human rights. Well, who talked about the human rights of the Libyans killed by
the State
Muammar
Department
Gaddafi?
Endlessly talked about
the Syrians by Assad's father.
I don't want to throw fuel on the fire, but we could talk about the fate of the Jews in the Arab countries, of what there are not many left
absolutely,
at all.
We can and we should. But I don't think that's going to take us much closer to Romney's situation, which was really about raising money for his campaign in the United States.
Let's bring in Aaron David Miller, because he's just joined us. He's from the Wilson Center. He's at the United States. What did you make of Romney's comments? I mean, they've been widely condemned as a gaffe, but if the man is saying what he truly believes, is that not what he should be saying?
Well, which comments are we talking about?
The
comments with respect to Jerusalem, Iran?
Specifically Jerusalem, yeah.
Which one?
Let's start with Jerusalem, and also what he said about the disparity in revenues between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
Right. The context of these remarks has to be understood in the reality that it is a political campaign, and while it's serious at times, it's also silly. And it seems to me the former governor's trip, was designed to deal with three constituencies, two of which he may have picked up a few points in. The third, I think, he didn't do himself much good. The first is the pro-Israeli community in the United States, which has identified, rightly or wrongly, a certain bloodlessness with respect to the way the current president reacts to the state of Israel. And Romney has sought to create a much keener and more acute emotional connection. So in a closely waged election, particularly among American Jews who vote in high percentages in places like Florida, and to raise money, he may have done himself a good turn. Maybe. The election isn't going to turn on Mitt Romney's foreign policy trip. Second, among evangelicals, he's mistrusted for a variety of reasons, and many are staunchly pro-Israel for reasons of eschatology and value affinity. He may have done himself a good turn there. Where I think he's just dropped the ball, and I give him a 4 on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being a virtuoso performance and 1 being a catastrophe. Where I don't think he's picked up points is among the core group that is going to determine, frankly, who the next president of the United States is, and that's independent voters. And I suspect that too many gaffes, too much lack of coordination, particularly on the Iran comment, probably has demonstrated that Mitt Romney is very much a work in progress when it comes to articulating clearly, authoritatively, and convincingly his capacity to understand some of these complicated foreign policy issues. So, again, what Mitt Romney did or didn't do on this trip, and I'm sorry to have tuned in so late, we're having technical problems, frankly, is not going to be determinative with respect to this campaign. And I think, frankly, the discussion is in some respects very misplaced. Foreign policy, for most Americans, unless it's higher gas prices or a terrorist attack on the continental United States, is simply not going to matter when they move to November to make a decision. Mm-hmm. I think it's logical for Mitt Romney to try to demonstrate where he is different than Barack Obama, but the point is, again, for Mitt Romney, and I'm not a Democrat on this one, I'm not a Republican. The dividing line for Mitt Romney should not be liberal or conservative, Republican, Democrat. It should be dumb or smart. And too many times on this trip, he simply didn't think before he spoke.
All right, let's get your response to that then, Erik Svane.
Well, first of all, I don't think Mitt Romney, and I think a lot of Americans don't appreciate a president who follows the leftist fairy tale where everybody is a friend, we're all friends together, and he doesn't see the reality of the show that the Russians aren't that friendly and the Chinese aren't that friendly. And that's what Mitt Romney isn't being a hawk. He's being realistic, and he's seen exactly what Putin is doing and who is doing. And you can go around and say and find excuses for them, but I think that the American people is tired of Obama finding excuses for the Chinese and the Russians and dropping our Eastern European allies for that. And I think they're tired of him going around on apology tours, apologizing for pretending that all of sins, all the problems in the world are the fault of the United States. That's one reason people like Mitt Romney or Newt Gingrich have become popular over the past months.
Is it simplistic to divide the world into friends and foes? Are things more complicated
George W.
than that?
Bush did a great job of it. He did that. He got us involved in 2 wars he couldn't finish, that we're still suffering from. He destroyed the American economy. I think the Republicans deserve all the credit they in the world for taking the country that had the greatest riches, the greatest future, the greatest power to do good, and essentially throwing that all away during the administration of George W. Bush. Now, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican either, but having covered those 8 years, I walked away from it absolutely appalled. And I think the problem with Romney is not that he's a bad man. I'm sure he's a very nice man. By the way, he's not a Christian. He's a Mormon. And by the way, just correcting another thing, the capital of the United States was not established in 1720. It was established very much later than that. But just to get away from the fantasy world for a while and the fantasy world of spin, I think Romney, as everybody understands, will take these positions and throw them in the wastebasket if he becomes president, and he will conduct foreign policy very much
just
the
like
same
Obama
way
did.
Every president has conducted foreign policy in line with the real world that surrounds us. The only departure from that was George W. Bush, who created a fantasy world that has become a nightmare world.
Okay,
Except for the victims of Saddam Hussein, who are quite realistic.
One moment. I'm sorry, we're going to have to take a short break. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We will come back after this. We'll have the headlines for you and the second part of this very heated debate. Don't go away.